just so. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for your patience as I do this, the technology here. So we're at part 3 on the home stretch now for our class on Jewish perspectives on leadership. And the way that I am doing the class is, again, the first part we looked at Abraham, second part we looked at Moses. Tonight I want to look at one of the prophets, the so-called minor prophets. His name is Amos in Hebrew, or Amos in English. It's interesting, just with Amos and Amos, it just reminded me, I was at an interfaith clergy lunch today and met the new imam of the mosque that's on Good Hope Road. So his name is, and I'm going to butcher it, Mebushar, I think it's Mebushar Ahmad. I think that's his name. And he's new to the area from Houston, Texas. Mebushar. So I asked him, what does that name mean? Because it's an Arabic name. And he says, giving the good news. And I said, because I'm weird that way, I said to him, well, in Hebrew, the exact same word would be mevaser. So mebushar in Arabic, mevaser in Hebrew is the exact same word. So it's just interesting how that works. So it's interesting to me. I don't know if it's interesting to you, and I don't know how that comes across in a social situation that tells somebody, an imam, that his name in Hebrew is the same thing. But anyway, that's just how it worked with me. Anyway, so that's why it's Amos versus Amos. And so I focused the class deliberately this way because I think there's a lot that we can learn from the Bible, and especially from the rabbinic commentary on the Bible as to what we're supposed to learn from these people about how to act and what kind of model they're supposed to be for us for all sorts of situations, and especially for leadership, because leadership really isn't just about the leaders themselves, that leaders themselves shouldn't just model their behavior on these characters, but really all of us should try to model ourselves and live up to the model that the people in the Bible live their lives, and how the rabbis interpreted that they live their lives. So a little bit about Amos and why I chose Amos of all the prophets or anybody else in the Bible to look at. So I remember a book from rabbinical school called Amos versus Amaziah. It's a short book based on an incident that occurs in this book of Amos, which highlights the debate within Israeli society at the time. We're talking about the 700s BCE, so we're talking 2,700 years ago. Is that right? We're in 2017, and that's the 700s BCE, so 700 and 2000, yes, 2,700 years ago. The role that certain people had in society in order for them to be considered leaders or teachers within the community. So the prophets in our tradition, so we're talking, the ones that have books are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Those are the 3 big ones. And they're big ones because their books are big, not necessarily because they're more important than any of the other prophets. And the 12 minor ones, minor because their books are small in comparison. The largest of any of the books would be Hosea, 12 chapters long. And the smallest is Obadiah, or Ovadia in Hebrew, who's only one chapter. Jonah, 4 chapters, which all of it we read on Yom Kippur afternoon as the Haftarah for Yom Kippur afternoon. And we have Amos, which is 9 chapters long. And so all the others are between 12 and 1 chapter, 12 of them, 12 minor prophets. There are other prophets in our tradition who don't have a book who are mentioned over the course of other books of the Bible. So there was a prophet who worked with King David. He was the prophet Nathan. There were 1 or 2 other prophets. Samuel could be considered a prophet, or he could be considered a judge. He has his own book. And there are a few others who are mentioned over the course of history. But the main prophets are those, the 3 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. And the role of the prophet, as opposed to the priest, is to remind the people of how they should behave, to tell them how they are behaving improperly and how they should change their behavior, that is, in terms of their religious attitude and their belief in God. And they also serve to criticize the king or the priest or the priesthood for their corrupt behavior. So we should know that in the history of the kingdom of Israel, so what we're talking about is, let's say Joshua leads the people into Israel around between 1300 and 1200 BCE, roughly. We don't know exactly, somewhere around there. It takes a couple hundred years to settle the land, and you have this group of leaders called judges, who are either regional leaders, they weren't all national leaders. Then you have the first king, King Saul. Then the dynasty began and ended with him. Then you have David. And you have the Davidic dynasty, about which our prayers are based, that we look forward to the Mashiach ben David, the Messiah, son of David. So that all the kings of Israel, well, I'll qualify that statement in a minute, are all descended from King David. And when the Davidic dynasty ended with the exile to Babylonia, then there were no more kings again. I could qualify that. There were Hasmonean kings. So with Hanukkah and the revolt against the Greek Empire, we had kings, but they were not related to King David. And then the Romans came and they kicked the Hasmoneans out and set up their own puppet king like Herod. And then the destruction of the temple. No more kings until the Messiah comes. And the Messiah is supposed to be descended from King David. So it was King David, then his son Solomon. Solomon dies and the kingdom splits, because it should be the firstborn son takes over as the next king. It didn't work with Solomon. Solomon was the youngest, not the oldest. David was still alive, but on his deathbed, and he fulfilled his promise to Bathsheba that their son Solomon would be king. He proclaimed that Solomon would be king, then he died, Solomon became king. With a little bit of a struggle there, but Solomon became king. Solomon dies, 2 of his sons want to be king, and there was no settlement to that. One took the northern half of the kingdom. The other took the southern half. The northern half became Israel. The southern half became Judah. So we're Jews because we're from Judah. Israel, Judah, separate kingdoms, and so separate in that the northern kingdom sets up its own temple. They build their own temple, and sacrifices are offered in their own temple in the northern kingdom instead of coming to Jerusalem. That is a no-no, and heresy and blasphemy, and that's all the prophets, not all the prophets, I was going to say all the prophets come from the southern kingdom. That's not true. All the prophets prophesy against the northern kingdom and what a terrible rebellion they did, how it's a rebellion against the people, it's a rebellion against God, and that's a major part of the prophecy, that to tell them how bad they are and to try to get them to come back into the fold. So until the 700s, when the Assyrians come, destroy the northern kingdom, exile the northern kingdom, and they're never heard from again. So the 10 lost tribes are those 10 tribes that make up the northern kingdom of Israel, forever gone to history, because the Assyrians forced the Israelites to become assimilated within their society, as opposed to the Babylonians 200 years later, 150, 200 years later, who exile the southern kingdom to Babylonia and let the Jews live by themselves wherever they wanted. So they didn't force them to assimilate. So it's thanks to the Babylonians that we're still around today. So some people say that the Ethiopian Jewish community is the tribe of Dan. Some people say there's a Jewish community from India, from Cochin, India, that might be the tribe of Manasseh. That's their legend. We don't know for sure. So, and then, if you remember the ads in New York, Levy's rye bread, you don't have to be Jewish to enjoy Levy's rye. So you have Native Americans pictured on a poster, maybe the lost tribe of one of the lost tribes of Israel. So who knows? Who knows what happened to those tribes? Anyway, so the prophets prophesy against the transgressions of the northern kingdom, and Amos is one of them. He is a little bit different from other prophets in that he is really from the tribe of Judah, and his work was to prophesy against the northern kingdom. There's work to do within Judah too. It's not to say that the southern kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, was so nice and so religious. They're not, and a lot of prophets work to prophesy against the kings of Judah and the people of Judah as well. But the nation of the northern kingdom is even worse. Worse in that they have their own separate temple. There's only supposed to be one, the temple in Jerusalem. Everybody's supposed to come there. That's a unifying force. And to highlight the split, there's their own temple, either in Shomron, or Amos is talking about an altar in Bethel, in Beit El, which is why a lot of synagogues are called Beit El, because of the town in Israel, Beit El, and an altar that that Abraham had set up there, and also followed by Jacob as well. And there's a community of Beit El, which is located in the West Bank today. Not sure if archaeological discoveries have found any relationship to Jacob or Abraham, but that's the spot that is, according to legend, the historical Beit El. So what I wanted to look at with Amos today is just to highlight a couple of things that he says, which is typical of prophets, but it's Amos has his unique style among all the prophets and how he gets his message across. And then look at this 8-sentence section in which he has an issue with the priest Amaziah. So just an example of Amos's preaching against Israel. We have chapter 3 of Amos. You can look this up afterwards, but I'll read some of it to get a sense of what Amos sounds like. Hear this word, O people of Israel, that the Lord has spoken concerning you, concerning the whole family that I brought up from the land of Egypt. You alone have I singled out of all the families of the earth. That is why I will call you to account for all your iniquities. Can two walk together without having met? Does a lion roar in the forest when he has no prey? Does a great beast let out a cry from its den without having made a capture? Does a bird drop on the ground in a trap with no snare there? Does a trap spring up from the ground unless it has caught something? When a ram's horn is sounded in a town, do the people not take alarm? Can misfortune come to a town if the Lord had not caused it? Indeed, my Lord God does nothing without having revealed his purpose to his servants the prophets. A lion has roared, who can but fear? My Lord God has spoken, who can but prophesy? Proclaim in the fortresses of Ashdod and in the fortresses of the land of Egypt, say, gather on the hill of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and witness the great outrages within her and the oppression in her midst. They are incapable of doing right, declares the Lord. They store up lawlessness and rapine in their fortresses. Assuredly, thus said my Lord God, an enemy all about the land, he shall strip you of your splendor, and your fortresses shall be plundered. Thus said the Lord, as a shepherd rescues from the lion's jaws 2 shank bones or the tip of an ear, so shall the Israelites escape who dwell in Samaria with the leg of a bed or the head of a couch. Hear this and warn the house of Jacob, says my Lord God, the God of hosts, that when I punish Israel for its transgressions, I will wreak judgment on the altar of Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be cut off and shall fall to the ground. I will wreck the winter palace together with the summer palace. The ivory palaces shall be demolished, and the great houses shall be destroyed, declares the Lord. So it's just one of many examples from the book, and here's another from chapter 5. Hear this word which I intone as a dirge over you, O house of Israel. Fallen, not to rise again, is maiden Israel, abandoned on her soil, with none to lift her up. For thus said my Lord God about the house of Israel, the town that marches out 1,000 strong shall have 100 left, and the one that marches out 100 strong shall have but 10 left. Thus said the Lord to the house of Israel, seek me and you will live. Do not seek Bethel, nor go to Gilgal, nor cross over to Beersheba, for Gilgal shall go into exile, and Bethel shall become a delusion. Seek the Lord and you will live, else he will rush like fire upon the house of Joseph and consume Bethel with none to quench it. So here we have a religious message from Amos. It's mainly a religious message about having transgressed against God, and it's a slight political message too against the palaces that we heard about in chapter 3. So that's something against the king of the northern kingdom of Israel as well. So any thoughts about this so far before I get into the Amatzia thing? So this is just a typical example of all the prophets and what they have to say. They usually don't have anything good to say because then they don't need the book. If people are good, you don't need a prophet. It's mainly that the people are bad. And we're talking about several hundred years. King David is around the year 1000 BCE, and the exile to Babylonia is 414 years later in 586 BCE. So for those 414 years, you only have a couple years really of the people of Israel and the kings of Israel being righteous. You can really count on one hand the number of kings of Judah who were considered righteous, really. So King David is considered righteous even though he forced himself on Bathsheba and killed Bathsheba's husband by sending him to the front lines in order for him to have Bathsheba as a wife. So despite that, still, King David is considered the author of all 150 Psalms in the Bible and is considered the greatest of all kings of Israel. So a flawed character, but still the greatest of all kings. You have King Hezekiah and you have King Zedekiah, who are good kings of Israel, of Judah, and you have King Josiah, who, well, now let me back up. The worst king of Judah was Manasseh. He ruled for 50 years. So he was the longest ruling king of Israel, like Queen Victoria of Israel. And he was the worst of them all. Not only did he allow idol worship into the temple in Jerusalem, but he also brought back child sacrifice. So, terrible, terrible king. Josiah comes after him and kind of he finds a scroll of the Torah, which scholars think is the book of Deuteronomy, finds that book and is motivated to clean house, literally and figuratively, and bring back appropriate right Israelite worship to the temple in Jerusalem. So that's a haftarah before Passover. This cleaning up of the house, Shabbat Shkalim, is all about King Josiah or Yehoash, and he's the one who restored Israelite worship to the temple in Jerusalem. So again, so you got three kings out of many kings of Judah. So Jeremiah prophesied in Judah at the time of the exile to Babylonia, and all the other minor prophets are either from the time of the Assyrian exile or later. And so they all are about motivating people to go back to God. And then you have this section from Amos, which highlights another component. Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent this message to King Jeroboam of Israel. Okay, so the temple is in Bethel in the northern kingdom. Amaziah is the priest. He's doing the sacrifices there. We don't know what kind of sacrifices. It could be the same sacrifices that we know from the Torah, or they could be additional sacrifices or different ones. We don't know, but Amaziah, which is a good Jewish name, that is, God is my strength or my courage. The priest of Bethel sent this message to King Jeroboam of Israel. Amos is conspiring against you within the house of Israel. The country cannot endure the things he is saying. For Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel shall be exiled from its soil. Okay, so prophets will say that. Prophets will declare, that's the only sense that makes prophecy and what the prophets say kind of futuristic, kind of foretelling what would happen if the people don't change their ways. And they will say things against the king. So Amos says, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and that Israel shall be exiled from its soil. Well, Israel definitely is exiled from its soil. Does Jeroboam die by the sword? I don't know offhand. Amaziah also said to Amos, Seer, off with you to the land of Judah, because that's where he's from. Earn your living there and do your prophesying there. But don't ever prophesy again at Bethel, for it's a king's sanctuary and a royal palace. Get out of town, Amos. We're revoking your visa. Go back to the southern kingdom and do your work there. We don't want any of you. We don't want your business here. Leave us alone. And you're talking bad against the king and about our future. Get out of here. Amos answered Amaziah, I am not a prophet, and I am not a prophet's disciple. I am a cattle breeder and a tender of sycamore figs, which is how we're introduced to him at the beginning of the book. But the Lord took me away from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go prophesy to my people Israel. And so, hear the word of the Lord. You say I must not prophesy about the house of Israel, or preach about the house of Isaac. But this, I swear, is what the Lord said. Your wife shall play the harlot in the town, your sons and daughters shall fall by the sword, and your land shall be divided up with a measuring line. And you yourself shall die on unclean soil, for Israel shall be exiled from its soil. Okay, so that from that section comes a whole book from a biblical scholar about Amos versus Amaziah, about the role of the prophet and the political statements that a prophet makes. So, what I want to get at is the idea: what place does his prophecy about the king and his statements about the king have to do with his religious statements? Why are the two intertwined? If we think the Bible is a religious text that is supposed to be talking about just how we as individuals are supposed to behave, what do we care about how a king is supposed to behave, and what does the prophet care about how the king is acting? So Adriana is asking, isn't the king appointed by God? So the first king was, King Saul was anointed by Samuel, the judge, prophet, to symbolize to the entire people he was anointed with oil. That's what Mashiach means, means anointed. So he's anointed with oil in front of the whole community. And then David was anointed with oil, and every subsequent king would be anointed as well. So yes, in that way, it kind of carries on the idea that this king from this house is chosen by God. So the northern kingdom is not chosen by God because God did not want the kingdom of Israel to be divided in two. So even though they would anoint their kings, they claim that they're doing it in the name of God. It's not in the name of God because history is written by the winners, and the southern kingdom of Israel wins out over the northern kingdom. So yes. So then, if the king is chosen by God, then the prophet has the right to talk about the king in that way, because the king is subject to these religious principles and these religious laws too. What we find throughout history, as recorded in these books, is that Jeremiah, for example, is thrown into jail for prophesying against the king, and not only prophesying against the king, but also kind of getting people upset in that we're supposed to give in to the Babylonians and not fight against them, because the Babylonians are a Babylonian army is God's tool, and we can't fight against God's tool. It would be rebellion against God if we fought against the Babylonians, and the king of Judah wanted to fight the Babylonians. So he throws Jeremiah in jail, and Jeremiah, of course, is subsequently released. But and even before he's thrown into jail, he runs away to Egypt to kind of ensure that he doesn't get arrested. So there's a lot going on with Jeremiah, and here Amos comes from out of town, goes to the northern kingdom, and prophesies against Amaziah, the priest of the temple in Bethel, and against the king. So we can understand why he would prophesy against Amaziah, and now we understand why he's prophesying against the king, because the king also is going against God. So this element that I wanted to share, that Amos and all the prophets add to Abraham and Moses, is this political aspect as well. That Abraham and Moses were models of justice and advocating for social justice and advocating to God on behalf of the community. What the prophets add is a sense too of criticizing. There's a sense of rebuking and criticizing that goes with leadership as well. And that if you see something wrong, people acting in the wrong way, violating religious law according to the Bible, then we have the right, like the prophet, to stand up against it and to preach against it and to try to convince people to change their ways. That's an element of leadership as well. So, any thoughts or comments or questions about this? Yeah, David.
Well, the king was the divine right.
Yes.
He started the divine, but he also was looked up to by the people. How he acted would be how they would act.
Right.
If you want to get the people to change, you got to start at the top.
So David is suggesting, just for those watching, that perhaps the need to criticize the king is that the king is a model for all the people, and people follow what the king, how the king acts and what the king does. So if the king is acting a particular way, then the people are going to act that way too. So you have to start at the top. That could be true, but there could be righteous people in the community who are minding their own business and are acting in an appropriate way. Now, we don't know for sure, just a second, Marie. We don't know for sure about exactly what the nature of the Israelite community at this time was. Archaeological discoveries have found houses of individuals in these towns throughout Israel, and invariably in these houses you will find idols of Canaanite gods and other gods, like a fertility god and things like that there. So these people, and there's Hebrew on some things that are found in the house too. So you know it's an Israelite home because you find Hebrew, and you see a fertility goddess, a little statue in there too. And then you see that what the prophets are talking about is based in fact in that the people are not totally monotheistic and not totally following in God's ways. So were there people who did not have idols in their houses? I'm not sure, but the majority of people at this time, Israelites, were pagan or had pagan elements. I guess what I'm saying is societal norms were such that, if everybody else has a goddess, we'll have a goddess in our house too, right? There are a number of Jewish families in America that will have a Christmas tree because other people have a Christmas tree, so why not have a Christmas tree too? Not to say that Christmas tree is necessarily religious. It is, but most people don't see it that way. But they might have seen these fertility gods in the same way. Doesn't mean anything to me. Everybody else has one. I'll have one too. Why not? So it's possible that the people would like that, but even that for a prophet is too much. Not supposed to have it in your house. Destroy all these pagan images. Can't worship a tree or anything like that. So there could have been some individuals who went against what the king wanted in terms of let's follow these pagan gods. But mostly, I think you're right that you have to start with the top. And you're not going to get your message across if a prophet is prophesying to David Polinsky. You're not going to make a book out of that. But if you're prophesying against the king, all right, people will listen to you and say, oh, this crazy guy's on the soapbox again. Let's go hear the crazy things he says. And if you look at all the different prophets, they each have their own special style in how they're talking. So let's go hear Amos. We're into his kind of music today. Let's hear the Amos way to speak. Don't like Amos today? Let's hear what Obadiah has to say, because I like the way he has to put it. So that's what it was. It was the entertainment of the day. All these people in the market of the town would get up on their box and speak. And the most famous one, the most popular articulate, got a book written. Either they wrote it themselves, or Jeremiah had his own scribe, Baruch, son of Neriah. He's mentioned directly in the book. So other prophets had their scribes. The more famous ones, they might have their guitar case in front of them. People throw the money in, and that's how they made their money. And though the book doesn't say that, the biblical books don't say how they made their money. Amos was a shepherd or a tiller of sycamores, so you make some money that way. Other people, it's not clear exactly what they did. Ezekiel was a priest, but he's in exile in Babylonia, so it's kind of hard to make a living when you don't have a temple and people bringing sacrifices to the temple to eat off of. So it's unclear how others made a living. So it's possible that they were dependent upon the charity of the people. Marie, what did you want to say before?
It seemed like in your two earlier examples with Abraham and Moses, there was a unity of political, social, religious leadership in a single individual.
Right.
Even if there's growth, even say, as you were saying, Moses learned, or Moses was learning over time, so they could have individual growth, but they had the direct connection to God as well as the moral authority and political authority. Here, it looks like there's a division of two sources of authority, and there's a secular authority combined with the religious authority and the king, but the higher moral authority and religious authority with the connection from God is outside of that, even that it's Amos.
Right.
And so you've got this division, but the outsider has the higher authority, or at least as written.
Okay, so Marie's bringing up an interesting point about the division. So Abraham and Moses had all aspects of leadership combined into their one person, being both a political and military and religious and moral authority for the people. So Abraham, not so much political because there's no nation of Israel yet, but for Moses, definitely so. And you had that, the judges, so if we go chronologically, you have Joshua taking over from Moses, so he continues in that same model. Then you have judges for the next 200 years throughout Israel, Samson being the most famous of them all, and Deborah, another one, a few others throughout the book. They're mostly regional, and they handle individual cases, like civil law cases come before them, and they also handle military struggles. Then Samuel is the last one of the judges period that is a transition to the kings, and the people go to Samuel and say, we want a king just like everybody else has a king. Samuel goes to God, and God says, okay, let them have it. And God says that because we have the book of Deuteronomy that says, when you get to the land of Israel and set up a king, this is how the king should act. So it's in the time of Samuel that you have all of this in one person split into different people, and that causes the trouble. Because then you have the king thinking that the king's in charge of everything for the people. And you have then the moral and religious conscience speaking in the king's ear in the form of the prophet. So, like I said, King David has the prophet Nathan, who is his conscience, who David has to admit that what Nathan says does come true, and that he's right, even though Nathan says some bad things about David and the way he acted. All the kings have these prophets who are their conscience. And so there's always this struggle between the two of them. And sometimes it comes to a head and the prophet is banished. And sometimes the king is influenced in a positive way by the prophet and changes his way. So that's why Zedekiah and Hezekiah are models for the rabbis, because they listen to the prophet of their day and they act appropriately and are models for how the king is supposed to act. So Hezekiah is famous for those of us who have been to Jerusalem and are physically able, know that just south of the old city, outside of what is called the Dung Gate, which is the gate that is closest to the Kotel. Okay, so outside of that, is an Arab part of town, Silwan, and there are archaeological dig is going on called the City of David dig, and you can walk through a tunnel underground from the time of King Hezekiah that brought water into the city, so that when the city was under siege, as the Book of Kings describes, Hezekiah had these engineers dig a tunnel to a spring to get water from that spring into Jerusalem. That tunnel was discovered, and it's really one of the coolest things to show that at least that part of the Bible is true. That there are questions about other stories in the Bible, but that one from King Hezekiah, the workers put up a sign. Here is where the workers who started up in the city behind the wall met the workers who started at the spring, and somehow, and feat of engineering from 2,700 years ago, 2,600 years ago, they met right there. And where they met, there's a plaque. And of course, the person who discovered it takes the plaque off the wall, and it's in some museum in Turkey today. I think that's what it is. And so Israel has been wanting to get the original back, but they have just a facsimile of it on that spot. Pretty cool that's there. That's what Hezekiah is famous for being able to defeat the Assyrians, who wanted to come down to the southern kingdom. After they had dealt with the northern kingdom of Israel, Hezekiah was able to defeat them, and etc. Anyway, that's just a tangent about Hezekiah. But the idea is that from the time of Samuel, when King Saul is selected as king, as the Bible recounts, always this struggle between the king and the prophet as to who is the moral voice. And then also the priest, the high priest in the temple in Jerusalem. So they are the ones offering the sacrifices on behalf of the people. They are not praying on their behalf, because there's no such thing as prayer. But they are supposed to do the ceremony for the people. So you have the king influencing the priest, saying, you know what, we should have some other sacrifices being offered here. And the priest sometimes would argue against the king. No, the Torah says we got to do this, and we're just sticking with this. But the king says, no, we're going to bring in some idols into the temple. And if the priest goes along with that, then the priesthood becomes corrupt as well. So you have corrupt kings, corrupt priests, and you have prophets as well. And the prophets that are in the Bible are the good prophets. You have other false prophets too, who are sometimes paid by the king to be the appropriate mouthpiece for the king, not necessarily speaking for God. And then you have the others who we only know after the fact are true prophets. But who's to say who are the true prophets? And I'm saying that it seems pretty clear that these prophets were on their soapboxes, just like other prophets were on their soapboxes. And they all said, I'm speaking for God. God says people of Israel do this. God says people of Judah do that. All of the prophets are saying that, and they all be acting in bizarre ways. Jeremiah sometimes would be walking around with sackcloth and ashes on his head and a yoke across his shoulders, and doing a variety of things to kind of physically embody the message that he wants to bring. So you can imagine then, if Jeremiah goes to see the king and he's dressed in sackcloth and has ashes on his head and a yoke across his shoulders, how the king is going to greet him and take him. Is he going to take him seriously or not? What a bizarre guy. I'm supposed to listen to him? So you can imagine then the tension between between the king and the prophet. And so again, I keep harping on this point of after the fact, because we really don't know for sure. We don't have proof that any of these prophets existed. We don't. We have some proof that some of the kings existed, like the history of the Assyrians and their defeat of the Israelites. That's corroborated in Assyrian sources that have been found. So there are cuneiform tablets that have been found from that time, so that those battles that the Book of Kings describes of the defeat by the Assyrians of the northern kingdom, that is corroborated in Assyrian history. So that's pretty cool. So, but that's as far back as we go. We can't corroborate that King David existed, though there was something that says Beit David, the house of David, that's found in some house in way up north in Israel. So does that mean that was David's house? Or does that mean that is the house of King David? Because we know in our sources that the dynasty of David is called Beit David. So archaeologists think that looks like a pretty good evidence that King David existed. We have other amulets and other things that have been found in this massive pile of dirt that the Muslim religious authority called the Waqf. They have been clearing out the Temple Mount and done excavations and building there, which they're not supposed to do. It goes against the status quo, but they're doing it anyway. They're just digging up the Temple Mount and throwing the dirt over the side. And Israeli archaeologists are sifting through that dirt and finding some remarkable material there that, like the oldest evidence of a verse from the Bible, the priestly blessing, was found in an amulet from that time. We're talking 2,500 years old. So that's, so this stuff, there's evidence that we were there. Is it evidence that everything that's in the Bible actually took place? That we don't have evidence for everything. There's no proof of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. That we don't have any proof for that. We don't have any proof that Moses existed either. No evidence that we were down in Egypt. No evidence of the plagues. No evidence of Mount Sinai. There are traditions where Mount Sinai was, but we don't know for sure. So the only evidence comes from the times of the kings. And then evidence of these particular prophets. Again, all we have is this book, our Bible. We don't have corroborating evidence of that. We have some names that the books of Chronicles mentions that we have found in the city of David excavations. But all that proves is that perhaps some of these names are common names. It's like finding the name Joe Smith or John Smith. Okay, that's nice to find that name, but if you look in the phone book, if you remember what a phone book is, there are lots of John Smiths in the phone book. So anyway, so what I wanted to conclude with, again, any other questions? Yes, Adriana.
Who was the last prophet?
So the last prophet, we have there are the minor prophets too. They are Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So those three, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, are prophets who prophesied when the people came back from Babylonian exile. So sent into exile 586, 70 years later, as Isaiah prophesied, in 70 years you'll come back. Well, that turned out to be true. The Persians defeated the Babylonians, and the Persian Emperor Cyrus allowed the Jews to go back. So Daniel, the book of Daniel, he's not a prophet, he was a courtier at that time. He convinced the Persian emperor to let the Jews go back, and Jews went back, and you have Ezra and Nehemiah as kind of civil leaders of the people, and you have Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi trying to convince the people to rebuild the temple. So those last ones, you're talking 500 BCE, no prophets since. So it's interesting why there are no prophets since then. You have other people who take up the mantle of doing some of the things that the prophets are doing, trying to be the moral voice for the people. So you have you have Mattathias and his 5 sons, the Maccabees, who in some way, not just militarily, and not just because Mattathias is a priest, as actual Kohen, but it also takes up this moral voice for the people. We have to fight against the evil Greek Empire and cleanse the temple of all the pagan idols that are there in the temple. So they try to bring both the political, the religious, and the moral authority together as in the Maccabees themselves. And then there's really no voice. You have the rabbis. You have the rabbis who try to be the voice of the prophets, but they never claimed to. It's interesting. They never actually claimed to be prophets. They actually said prophecy ended with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. But they tell stories about themselves that make it seem like they are prophets. Because Elisha, of all the prophets, Elisha is one. So he's talked about in the book of Kings. He doesn't have his own book. And he does this miracle stuff. We just read the Haftorah that has this story about how he foretold that this barren woman would have a baby, and in a year she does. Baby grows up, and he collapses. So she calls for Elisha to come. Hey, you prophesied that I'd have a baby, but I thought that meant that baby would be protected. Come. And so this, not a baby again, he's grown, collapses, seems like he's dead. Elisha lies on top of him, does CPR essentially, and a baby comes back to life. And he does other things. He tells some other poor woman, collect all the jars that you can, and start pouring, and olive oil miraculously comes out of all these jars, and so she can make money by selling olive oil. So he performs miracles like this. He's the only prophet that does that. And the rabbis tell stories about themselves that are similar to Elisha. They claim they're not prophets, but they tell stories about themselves that make it seem like they are prophets. So it's the rabbis who carry on the prophetic tradition, not the political tradition of kings or priestly tradition of the Kohanim, but this new tradition of being teachers, but also the moral authority of the people. So we'll talk next time as Maimonides explains what exactly is a political leader of the people, and what a king is supposed to act like, and who are the Jewish leaders today. So we'll talk about that next time. So have a good night, everybody.